Welcome to Soothing Stories. Tonight, settle in and let the world outside grow quiet. This is a story about the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. There is nothing you need to do now but listen and breathe. Let the words carry you gently into rest. The air was still warm from the day's heat when she stepped onto the tarmac at Lae, New Guinea, in the blue-grey light before dawn. The airfield lay at the edge of the world, a narrow strip of packed earth cut into the green wilderness that tumbled down to the sea. Palm trees stood in dark silhouette along the perimeter, their fronds hanging motionless in the heavy tropical air. Beyond them, the waters of the Huon Gulf stretched out toward an eastern horizon that had not yet begun to brighten. It was the 2nd day of July, 1937, and Amelia Earhart stood beside her silver aircraft and looked out at the vast Pacific Ocean that lay between her and home. The Lockheed Electra gleamed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness, its twin engine silent, its polished aluminium skin still cool from the night. It was a beautiful machine, sleek and purposeful, with its twin-tail fins and long tapered wings. The ground crew moved around it with quiet efficiency, checking fuel lines and tightening bolts, their voices low and unhurried in the early morning stillness. The smell of aviation fuel hung in the humid air, mixing with the sweeter scent of frangipani blossoms that drifted from somewhere beyond the edge of the field. Amelia watched the preparations with calm attention. She wore khaki trousers and a light cotton shirt, practical clothes for the long hours of flight that lay ahead. Her short hair was tucked beneath a leather flying cap, and her eyes, grey-blue and steady, moved from one detail to the next with the measured focus of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for exactly this moment. She had flown across the Atlantic alone. She had crossed the Pacific from Hawaii to California. She had set records and broken barriers and become, in the public imagination, something more than simply a pilot. But tonight, in the darkness before this particular dawn, she was simply a woman standing beside her aircraft, contemplating the longest and most dangerous leg of a journey that had already carried her 22,000 miles around the equator. Her navigator, Fred Noonan, emerged from the small operations building carrying a folder of charts and weather reports. He was a tall man with dark hair and a quiet manner, experienced in celestial navigation from years of plotting courses for Pan American Airways across these same Pacific waters. He had navigated flying boats between California and Hawaii, between Hawaii and Manila, across distances that most people could scarcely comprehend. The ocean was not unfamiliar to him. But tonight there was something in his expression, a slight tightness around the eyes, that spoke of the particular challenge that lay ahead. Their destination was Howland Island, a speck of coral and sand barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide, lying almost precisely on the equator, more than 2,500 miles to the northeast. Finding it would be like finding a single grain of sand scattered somewhere across the floor of a vast and empty room. The weather reports were not encouraging. Cloud cover was expected over portions of the route, which would make celestial navigation difficult. There were headwinds forecast for the latter portion of the flight, which would increase fuel consumption. The radio conditions were uncertain, as they often were in this part of the world, where atmospheric disturbances could turn clear signals into unintelligible static. But the window for departure was narrow, and they had already been delayed for days by weather and mechanical concerns. It was time to go. Amelia climbed into the cockpit through the small hatch on the left side of the fuselage. The interior of the Electra was cramped and functional, a workspace rather than a comfort, filled with instruments and gauges and the smell of metal and oil. She settled into the left-hand pilot seat and began her pre-flight checks with the methodical patience of long practice. Each dial was noted, each switch confirmed, each reading compared against the values she knew by heart. Behind her, separated by the fuel tanks that filled the center section of the fuselage, Fred arranged his charts and instruments on the small navigator's table, setting out his chronometer and drift sight and the plotting tools he would need for the long night ahead. The engines coughed and caught, one after the other, their twin Pratt & Whitney radials settling into a deep, steady rumble that vibrated through the airframe and into the bones of everyone standing nearby. The propellers became spinning discs of silver in the growing light, pulling air back over the wings in a steady stream that flattened the grass along the edges of the runway. The ground crew stepped back and raised their hands in farewell, their figures growing smaller as the Electra began to move, rolling forward with gathering speed along the packed earth strip. The takeoff run was long, longer than it should have been. The aircraft was heavy with fuel, every tank filled to capacity for the marathon flight ahead. 1,000 gallons of aviation fuel, enough to keep the engines running for more than 20 hours if they were careful. The weight pressed the wheels into the soft earth, and the Electra accelerated slowly, the end of the runway coming closer with each passing second. The trees at the far end grew larger. The cliff edge beyond them, dropping away to the sea below, came nearer and nearer. And then, at the very last moment, the wheels lifted free of the earth and the aircraft rose, barely clearing the vegetation, climbing out over the edge of the cliff and into the open air above the water. The blue-gray expanse of the Huon Gulf opened beneath them, its surface calm and unmarked in the early morning light. The aircraft climbed slowly, trading the weight of fuel for altitude, its engines working hard in the thick tropical air. Below, the coastline of New Guinea fell away, its green mountains and white beaches diminishing into the distance until they were nothing more than a dark line on the western horizon. Ahead, to the northeast, there was only the ocean. Vast, empty, unbroken by any landmark or feature. 2,500 miles of water, stretching all the way to a tiny island that they could not yet see, could not yet imagine, hidden somewhere beyond the curve of the earth. The first hours passed in relative calm. The Electra settled into its cruising altitude of 8,000 feet, the engines purring at their most efficient setting, the fuel gauges slowly, imperceptibly beginning their long decline from full. The sky above was a deep tropical blue, cloudless and infinite, and the ocean below was a darker mirror of it, its surface textured by wind and current into patterns that shifted and changed with hypnotic slowness. From this altitude, the waves were invisible as individual features, but their collective effect created a subtle shading across the water's surface, light and dark alternating in patterns that stretched to every horizon. Amelia flew with her hands light on the yoke, making small corrections as the aircraft responded to the invisible currents of the air. There was a rhythm to long-distance flying that she had learned over many years, a way of settling into the machine and becoming part of it, of letting the body relax while the mind remained alert to the instruments and the feel of the aircraft through the controls. The compass held steady on its northeast heading. The altimeter showed a constant 8,000 feet. The airspeed indicator read 150 knots. Everything was as it should be. The sun climbed higher as the morning progressed, its light shifting from the amber of dawn through gold and into the white brilliance of a tropical midday. The cockpit grew warm, then hot, the greenhouse effect of the windows concentrating the sun's energy into the small enclosed space. Amelia adjusted her position, loosened her collar, took a drink of water from the canteen she kept within reach. The monotony of ocean flight was its own kind of challenge, a test of patience and attention that was quite different from the physical demands of storm flying or the technical challenges of instrument approaches. Here, the danger was in the sameness of everything, in the way the unchanging horizon and the steady drone of the engines could lull the mind into a state of dreamy inattention. Behind the cockpit, separated by the bulk of the fuel tanks, Fred Noonan worked at his navigator's station. His world was one of numbers and angles, of time and distance and the precise measurement of celestial bodies against the horizon. During the daylight hours, he could take sun sights, measuring the angle of the sun above the horizon at known times and using these measurements to calculate their position. The mathematics were complex but familiar, a series of calculations that he had performed thousands of times before, each one producing a line on his chart that represented all the possible positions from which the sun would appear at that particular angle. Two such lines, taken at different times, would cross at a single point, their intersection marking the aircraft's position on the featureless ocean below. But the work was not easy. The aircraft vibrated constantly, making it difficult to hold the sextant steady. The horizon, seen from 8,000 feet, was not a sharp line but a hazy boundary between sea and sky that could be difficult to define precisely. And each calculation required access to reference tables and almanac data that had to be read carefully in the dim, cramped space of the navigator's station. Fred worked methodically, recording each observation in his log, plotting each position on the chart, tracking their progress across the empty Pacific. The hours accumulated like water filling a basin, slowly and without drama. 1 hour became 2, became 4, became 6. The sun traced its arc across the sky, climbing toward its zenith and then beginning its long descent toward the western horizon behind them. The fuel gauges continued their gradual decline, marking the passage of time in their own quiet way. The engines ran on, their sound so constant and so present that it became a kind of silence, a background against which the smaller sounds of the cockpit stood out in sharp relief, the creak of the airframe in turbulence, the tick of the compass card adjusting, the rustle of charts as Fred made his calculations. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to appear. At first they were scattered and thin, high wisps of cirrus that cast no shadow on the water below. But gradually they thickened, building into cumulus towers that rose from the ocean's surface in great columns of white and gray. The Electra threaded between them, deviating from its straight-line course to avoid the worst of the turbulence that lurked within the towering formations. Each deviation meant a slight change in their heading, a small addition to the total distance flown, a fractional increase in the fuel consumed. Fred noted each course change and calculated its effect on their position, adjusting his estimates accordingly. The clouds brought moisture, and with it a change in the quality of the air. The cockpit, which had been dry and hot, became humid. Condensation formed on the cooler metal surfaces, tiny droplets that caught the light and ran in slow rivulets down the instrument panel. The view through the windscreen alternated between clear blue sky and the soft gray interior of clouds, the aircraft emerging and re-entering their formations with a rhythm that was almost like breathing. There was something both beautiful and isolating about flying through clouds. The world contracted to the dimensions of the cockpit, all external reference lost in the uniform whiteness that surrounded the aircraft. The instruments became the only reality, their needles and numbers the only connection to a world that had become invisible. And then, emerging from the other side, the world would reassemble itself, the vast blue dome of sky above, the darker blue of ocean below, the horizon encircling them in a perfect and unbroken ring. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon behind them, its light took on the golden quality of late afternoon, painting the cloud tops in shades of amber and rose. The shadows of the clouds stretched long across the ocean's surface, dark patches on the water that moved with imperceptible slowness as the earth turned beneath them. It was beautiful, undeniably beautiful, this view from 8,000 feet above the empty Pacific, with the light of the dying day spreading across the world like liquid gold. Night came gradually, as it does in the tropics, the transition from day to darkness compressed into a brief and vivid twilight. The sun touched the western horizon and seemed to hesitate there, its lower edge flattened by refraction into a shape that was more oval than round. The sky above shifted through a spectrum of color, gold and orange nearest the horizon, deepening through rose and violet to a blue so dark it was almost black directly overhead. The first stars appeared, faint and tentative, as though uncertain whether the day had truly ended. And then the sun was gone, slipping below the edge of the world with a final flash of green light that lasted only a fraction of a second. The twilight deepened rapidly, the colors fading from the sky as though someone were slowly turning down a lamp. Within minutes, full darkness had settled over the ocean, a darkness that was profound and absolute in a way that could only be experienced far from land, far from any artificial light, in the middle of the greatest ocean on earth. The stars came out in their thousands, then their tens of thousands, filling the sky from horizon to horizon with a density of light that was almost overwhelming. The Milky Way stretched across the dome of heaven in a great pale river, its individual stars too numerous to count, their collective light casting a faint but perceptible illumination on the cloud tops below. The constellations that Amelia had learned to recognize from years of night flying were all present, Orion's belt near the horizon, the Southern Cross hanging in the southern sky, the bright points of Sirius and Canopus marking their positions with unwavering steadiness. In the cockpit, the instrument panel glowed with the soft amber light of its illumination. The dials and gauges created small pools of light in the darkness, each one a window into some aspect of the aircraft's performance. The artificial horizon showed the aircraft wings level, the directional gyroscope steady on its northeast heading, the engine instruments all within their normal ranges. Amelia flew by these lights now, her connection to the outside world reduced to the stars above and the faint reflection of starlight on the ocean far below. The engines ran on, their sound unchanged, as constant as the stars themselves. In the darkness, with the visual world reduced to the instruments and the stars, the sound of the engines became the dominant sensation. It was a complex sound, layered and textured, the deep bass of the cylinders firing overlaid with the higher whine of the propeller reduction gears and the rush of air over the wings and fuselage. After hours of exposure, the sound became something more than noise. It became a presence, a companion, a steady pulse that marked the passage of time as reliably as any clock. Fred Noonan worked with his sextant in the darkness, taking star sights through the overhead observation window. The stars were brilliant tonight, their positions sharp and well-defined against the black velvet of space. He measured the angles carefully, noting the time of each observation on his chronometer with the precision of long practice. Each star gave him a line of position, and 3 such lines, from 3 different stars, would intersect at a point that marked their location in the vastness of the Pacific night. But the work was growing more difficult as the hours passed. Cloud cover was building below and around them, obscuring the horizon that was essential for accurate celestial observations. Without a clear horizon, the angle measurements became unreliable, the calculations less certain. Fred made notes in his log, recording the conditions alongside his observations, flagging those readings he was less confident about. Their position was known, approximately, but the precision was slipping, the circle of uncertainty growing wider with each hour that passed without a clear sight. The night deepened. The cloud cover below grew more extensive, hiding the ocean completely from view. The aircraft flew above a floor of cloud that stretched unbroken in every direction, its surface silver-gray in the starlight, smooth and featureless as a frozen sea. There was no way to see the water, no way to judge the wind's effect on their track by watching the wave patterns below. They were flying blind in a sense, trusting their compass heading and their calculations to carry them toward an island they could not see, across an ocean they could no longer observe. The cloud layer below had a strange beauty of its own, illuminated by the starlight and the faint glow of the Milky Way. Its surface undulated gently, like a landscape of soft hills and shallow valleys rendered in shades of gray and silver. Here and there, a higher tower of cumulus rose above the general level, its summit catching the starlight and glowing faintly against the darker sky beyond. These towers were markers of the invisible ocean below, signs of the warmth and moisture rising from the tropical waters, but they offered no navigational value, no way to determine what lay beneath them. In the spaces between the clouds, when a momentary gap opened in the overcast, the ocean was briefly visible far below, its surface a black mirror reflecting nothing but darkness. The moonless night offered no illumination for the waters, and without the moon's silver pathway across the surface, the ocean was indistinguishable from the sky, a void that extended downward as surely as the void extended upward. It was as though the aircraft flew through the center of an infinite sphere of darkness, suspended equidistant between 2 incomprehensible depths. The temperature in the cockpit had dropped as they climbed above the cloud layer. At 10,000 feet, the tropical warmth of the lower altitudes gave way to a cooler air that carried the faint taste of altitude, thin and clean and slightly metallic on the tongue. Amelia pulled on a light jacket that she kept within reach for the cold hours of high-altitude night flying. The fabric was worn and familiar, a garment she had worn on many flights before, its pockets containing the small objects that every pilot carries: a pencil, a folded chart, a pair of sunglasses for the dawn that would eventually come. The rhythm of the engines had settled into what experienced pilots call the sweet spot, that particular combination of RPM and manifold pressure at which the Pratt & Whitney radials ran most smoothly, their cylinders firing in a sequence so perfectly timed that the individual detonations merged into a single continuous note. It was a sound that Amelia knew intimately, the sound of her aircraft at its most efficient, burning fuel at the rate that would give them the greatest possible range. Every fraction of a gallon saved now was a fraction of a gallon available later, when they would need every drop for the search that might lie ahead. The stars continued their slow rotation overhead, wheeling around the celestial pole in arcs that took hours to complete. Time passed differently at altitude, measured not by the movements of hands on a clock but by the gradual shift of constellations from one side of the windscreen to the other. Vega, bright and blue-white, crossed from the left-hand window to the right over the course of an hour. The great square of Pegasus drifted slowly upward from the eastern horizon. And always, directly ahead, the same stars that had been there at the beginning of the flight, drawing them forward into the darkness like distant beacons lit in some unimaginable harbor. There is a quality to extended night flight that is difficult to describe to those who have not experienced it. It is neither wakefulness nor sleep, but something between the two, a state of heightened awareness that exists alongside a deep physical stillness. The body is motionless, held in place by the seat harness and the constraints of the small cockpit, but the mind ranges freely across time and space, touching on memories and anticipations and observations with a fluidity that seems impossible in the daylit world. Thoughts come and go without effort, rising from some deep well of consciousness and dissolving back into it like bubbles rising in still water. Amelia had written about this state in her books, describing it as one of the great rewards of long-distance flying. The solitude of the cockpit, the steady drone of the engines, the unchanging vista of stars and darkness, all combined to create a meditative space in which the pilot could achieve a clarity of thought that was rarely available on the ground. It was not distraction or inattention. The instruments were always present at the edge of awareness, their readings monitored with automatic vigilance, but rather a broadening of consciousness, a widening of the mental aperture that allowed thoughts to flow more freely and connections to form more easily. Perhaps she thought, during those long hours, of the flights that had brought her to this point. The Atlantic crossing of 32, alone through the night in her red Vega, fighting ice and mechanical failure and fatigue to reach the green fields of Ireland at dawn. The Pacific crossing of 35, from Honolulu to Oakland, another night of stars and instruments and the vast dark emptiness of ocean. Each flight had been its own world, complete and self-contained, a journey that existed outside normal time, marked not by the usual landmarks of daily life but by the fuel consumed and the distance covered and the slow wheeling of the stars. The aircraft encountered turbulence as it passed through the boundary between two atmospheric systems, the smooth air ahead giving way to a region of gentle bumps and swells that rocked the wings slightly and caused the compass card to oscillate back and forth across its heading. It was not severe enough to cause concern, merely enough to remind the pilot that the sky, for all its apparent emptiness, was not truly empty. It was full of movement, of rising and falling air, of temperature differences and pressure gradients that the eye could not detect but the aircraft could feel with the sensitivity of a living creature. Amelia corrected for each disturbance with small movements of the yoke, keeping the wings level, maintaining the heading, riding the turbulence with the easy skill of long practice. It was like riding a horse across uneven ground, the same quality of responsiveness and balance, the same need to absorb the irregularities rather than fight against them. The aircraft was alive in her hands, communicating through its control surfaces the exact nature of the air through which it passed. Beyond the turbulent zone, the air smoothed again, returning to the glass-like calm that characterized the upper levels of the tropical atmosphere. The stars steadied in their positions. The compass card settled back to its constant heading. The engines resumed their uninterrupted note. And the night continued, deep and dark and patient, holding the aircraft within its velvet darkness as a cupped hand holds water, gently and without effort. Amelia adjusted the fuel mixture, leaning the engine slightly for maximum efficiency at this stage of the flight. The fuel gauges showed that they had consumed roughly half their supply, which was about right for the halfway point of the journey. But the gauges were not perfectly precise instruments, and the actual consumption depended on variables that were difficult to measure exactly: the strength of headwinds, the efficiency of the engines at different altitudes and temperatures, the extra fuel burned during the deviations around clouds. The margins were adequate but not generous. There was fuel for perhaps 20 hours of flight, and the distance to Howland Island, at their current ground speed, would require approximately 2 hours of reserve. Enough, if everything went well. Not much to spare if it did not. The hours between midnight and dawn are the longest hours in any long-distance flight. The body is at its lowest ebb, its natural rhythms crying out for sleep, and the mind must fight against its own desire for rest. The cockpit was dark and warm, the sound of the engines as steady and soothing as a lullaby. Amelia shifted in her seat, stretched her legs as much as the cramped space allowed, took another drink of water. She had flown through many nights before, had learned the techniques for keeping herself alert, changing the trim of the aircraft slightly to require active flying, counting rivets on the wing in the dim light, reciting poetry she had memorized as a girl. But the fatigue was cumulative, building through the hours, and each subsequent night flight was slightly harder than the last. The radio had been quiet for many hours. They had last communicated with Ley shortly after takeoff, reporting their departure and initial heading. Since then, there had been no contact, no voices from the ground to break the isolation of the cockpit. The radio equipment in the Electra was capable of both voice communication and Morse code, but its range was limited, and the atmospheric conditions over the Central Pacific were notoriously difficult for radio propagation. Signals that should have carried clearly for hundreds of miles were absorbed or reflected by the ionosphere in unpredictable ways, reducing them to fragments of static or silencing them entirely. As dawn approached, Amelia began to tune the radio to the frequencies that had been arranged for their approach to Howland Island. The United States Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed off the island, tasked with providing radio navigation assistance and communication relay for the final portion of the flight. The plan was simple in concept. The Itasca would transmit radio signals on known frequencies, and Amelia would use her radio direction finder to home in on these signals, following them like a beacon to the tiny island. It was a standard technique, well proven on countless flights before. but the effectiveness of radio direction finding depended on clear signals, good atmospheric conditions, and properly functioning equipment. None of these could be guaranteed over the Central Pacific. The eastern sky began to lighten, the stars fading one by one as the dawn spread upward from the horizon. The cloud layer below remained solid, hiding the ocean from view, but its surface caught the first light of day and began to glow with a soft pink luminescence that spread slowly across its extent. The transition from night to day brought a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the cockpit, a lifting of the heaviness that the long night hours had imposed. Daylight meant visibility. Daylight meant the possibility of seeing their destination, of confirming their position by visual reference to the tiny island that lay somewhere ahead. But the clouds below showed no sign of breaking. They extended in every direction, a solid overcast that hid the ocean as completely as a drawn curtain. Above the clouds, the sky was clear and blue, the sun climbing rapidly as it always did near the equator, rising almost vertically from the horizon. The light was brilliant and sharp, casting hard shadows across the instrument panel and forcing Amelia to squint against its intensity. She lowered the sun visor and adjusted her position, scanning the cloud layer ahead for any break, any gap that might offer a glimpse of the water below. Fred Noonan took a sun sight, his last good celestial observation, measuring the angle of the sun above the horizon at a precisely noted time. The calculation placed them somewhere in the vicinity of their intended track, but the position was approximate. Hours had passed since his last confident fix, and in those hours the wind might have pushed them north or south of their planned route by an amount that was impossible to determine without visual reference or radio navigation. The uncertainty was growing, the possible area where the aircraft might actually be expanding with each passing minute. At approximately 19 hours into the flight, Amelia made her first radio transmission to the Itasca. Her voice came through the receiver on the cutter's bridge, distorted by static but intelligible, reporting that they were on course and would be in the vicinity of Howland Island within an hour. The signal was strong, suggesting that they were not far away, but it provided no directional information, no way for the Itasca to determine which direction the aircraft was coming from. The radio operators on the cutter tried to respond, transmitting voice messages and long strings of Morse code on the frequencies that had been prearranged, but there was no acknowledgement from the Electra. The signals, it seemed, were traveling in only one direction. The next hour brought a series of transmissions from Amelia, each one slightly different in tone and content, each one suggesting a growing uncertainty about their position. She reported overcast skies and an inability to see the island. She asked the Itasca to transmit on a specific frequency so that she could take a radio bearing. She reported that they were running low on fuel. But between these transmissions, there were long silences, minutes stretching into quarter hours during which the radio operators on the Itasca could do nothing but listen and wait and hope that the next transmission would bring better news. The men on the Itasca stood on the bridge and scanned the sky with binoculars, looking for any sign of the aircraft. The weather over Howland Island was partly cloudy, with good visibility below the clouds. If the Electra came within sight of the island, they would see it. But the ocean stretched away in every direction, empty and featureless, and the sky above the clouds showed nothing but its own immense blue blankness. The minutes passed, each one adding to the weight of tension that hung over the cutter like a physical presence. At 20 hours and 14 minutes into the flight, Amelia's voice came through the radio again, clearer this time, the signal strength indicating that she was close. She reported that they must be directly over the island but could not see it. She said they were flying at 1,000 feet altitude. She asked again for a bearing from the Itasca's radio transmissions. The operators responded immediately, transmitting on every frequency they had available, but there was no indication that Amelia received their signals. The communication was achingly one-directional, a voice calling out from the sky with no way to hear the answers being shouted back. The sun climbed higher as the morning progressed, and the transmissions from the Electra became more frequent but no more reassuring. Amelia reported that they were flying north and south along what she believed to be the line of position that Fred had calculated from his last sun sight. This was a navigational technique of last resort, a way of searching for a destination when the exact position was unknown. If they could determine their latitude from a sun sight, they could fly along that line of latitude, east and west, knowing that the island lay somewhere on that line. But the line extended for hundreds of miles in each direction, and without knowing which direction to search, they could fly away from the island as easily as toward it. There was something in Amelia's voice during these final transmissions that the radio operators on the Itasca would later try to describe and find themselves unable to. It was not panic, certainly not that. It was something more like concentrated focus, a tightening of attention that spoke of a mind working at full capacity to solve a problem that was growing more urgent with each passing minute. The fuel was finite. The time was limited. The island remained invisible somewhere below the clouds or beyond the horizon, hiding itself with the indifference of geography from the two human beings who searched for it with increasing desperation. At 20 hours and 24 minutes, the last transmission came. Amelia's voice, clear and strong, reported that they were on the line of position 157-337, that they were running north and south, and that they were running low on fuel. Her voice was steady, her diction precise. She gave the information that a navigator would need to understand their search pattern. And then the radio fell silent. The operators on the Itasca waited, their hands on their equipment, their ears straining against the static. They transmitted their own signals repeatedly, calling the aircraft by its call sign, asking for any response, any acknowledgement. But the frequency that had carried Amelia's voice for the past several hours now carried nothing but the empty hiss of atmospheric noise. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Then an hour. The sky above Howland Island remained empty, unmarked by any aircraft. The silence that followed was a silence of a particular kind. It was not the comfortable silence of a conversation's natural end, nor the brief silence between movements of a symphony. It was a silence that grew heavier with each passing moment, a silence that contained within it the slow crystallization of understanding. Something had happened. Something had gone wrong in a way that could not be undone by waiting, could not be resolved by further patience. The aircraft was not coming. The radio would not speak again. The Itasca began its search immediately, turning from its station off Howland Island and steaming in the direction from which Amelia's signals had seemed to come. Other ships and aircraft would join the search in the days that followed, the largest and most expensive search and rescue operation that the Pacific had ever seen. Navy battleships and aircraft carriers, Coast Guard cutters, civilian vessels, military aircraft from bases across the Pacific, all converging on the area around Howland Island to search the endless blue expanse of water for any sign of the missing aircraft or its crew. But the ocean kept its secrets. Day after day, the ships crisscrossed the search area, their lookouts scanning the water from dawn to dusk, and found nothing. No wreckage floating on the surface. No oil slick marking the spot where an aircraft might have gone down. No signal mirror flashing from a life raft. No distress signal from an emergency transmitter. Nothing but water and sky and the empty horizon stretching away in every direction, indifferent to the small human drama playing out upon its surface. The Pacific Ocean is a vast and patient presence. It covers more of the Earth's surface than all the land masses combined, its waters stretching from the frozen margins of Antarctica to the ice-choked passages of the Arctic, from the volcanic shores of Asia to the beaches of the Americas. Within its depths lie mountain ranges taller than the Himalayas and trenches deeper than any canyon on land. Its currents circle the globe in great slow gyres, carrying warmth from the equator toward the poles and cold from the poles back toward the equator in a cycle that has continued without interruption for millions of years. In this immensity, a single aircraft is a very small thing. The Lockheed Electra, for all its gleaming aluminium and powerful engines, was barely 40 feet from wingtip to wingtip, a mote of silver in the vast blue emptiness. To land upon the ocean's surface, whether by choice or by necessity, was to become immediately and utterly insignificant in the face of that immensity. The waves that seem gentle from 8,000 feet reveal themselves at sea level to be rolling hills of water, 5 and 6 and 8 feet high, capable of swamping a small craft in minutes. The currents that appear as subtle shadings on the surface from altitude become, at water level, irresistible forces that carry everything upon them in whatever direction they choose. The search continued for 16 days. Ships and aircraft covered more than 250,000 square miles of ocean, an area larger than many countries, and found nothing. On July 18, the search was officially called off. The ocean had not given up its secret, and no amount of searching seemed likely to persuade it otherwise. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were declared lost at sea, and the world was left to wonder what had happened in those final minutes after the radio fell silent. In the years that followed, the mystery of Amelia Earhart's disappearance would become one of the most enduring enigmas of the 20th century. Theories multiplied and evolved, each one attempting to explain what had happened when the radio signals stopped and the silver aircraft vanished from the known world. Some believed that the Electra had simply run out of fuel and ditched in the ocean, sinking quickly beneath the waves and carrying its occupants with it into the deep. The Pacific, at its deepest, descends more than 35,000 feet beneath the surface, a depth at which the pressure is so great that even metal is crushed, and light has never penetrated. Others believed that Amelia and Fred might have found land, not Howland Island but one of the many small atolls and reef islands that dot the central Pacific like scattered seeds. Garner Island, now known as Nikimerow, lay roughly 350 miles south-southeast of Howland, a coral atoll with a shallow lagoon and a fringe of coconut palms. It was uninhabited in 1937, a place where shipwrecked sailors might survive for a time on coconuts and fish and rainwater, but where rescue would depend on being found by passing ships that rarely came that way. Still others wove more elaborate tales, stories involving Japanese military forces and secret missions and captures and imprisonments. These stories grew in the telling, each version adding new details and new complications, until the simple fact of a missing aircraft had been transformed into something resembling a spy novel. But beneath all the speculation and all the theories, the fundamental truth remained unchanged: the aircraft had disappeared, and the ocean had not revealed where. There is something about an unsolved mystery that holds the human mind in a particular way. It is like a melody left unresolved, a chord that never reaches its tonic, a sentence that trails off before reaching its conclusion. The mind returns to it again and again, turning it over, examining it from different angles, searching for the piece of information that will make everything suddenly clear. In the case of Amelia Earhart, generations of researchers and enthusiasts have devoted years of their lives to this searching, poring over radio transcripts and navigation logs and weather reports, analyzing photographs and bone fragments and artifacts found on remote islands, each one hoping to be the person who finally answers the question that the Pacific Ocean posed in July of 1937. But perhaps the mystery itself is part of what makes the story endure. If the Electra had been found the next day, floating intact on the surface with its crew safe aboard, the story would have been remarkable but not memorable. It would have been filed away with hundreds of other aviation incidents, a footnote in the history of flight. Instead, the disappearance transformed Amelia Earhart from a remarkable pilot into something approaching a myth, a figure who exists in the public imagination as perpetually in flight, perpetually crossing that vast Pacific, perpetually reaching toward an island that remains forever just beyond the horizon. The ocean does not deal in human timescales. What seems urgent and tragic to us is, to the Pacific, merely a momentary ripple on a surface that has been in motion for 4 billion years. The water that may have received the Electra on that July morning has long since moved on, carried by the currents to distant shores and back again many times over. The coral has continued to grow. The fish have continued to swim. The waves have continued their eternal rhythm, rising and falling, advancing and retreating, patient and unhurried as they have always been. But let us return, for a moment, to the cockpit of the Electra in those final hours, not to the drama of the search or the weight of the mystery, but to the simple human experience of being there, in that small space, above that vast ocean, in the grey light of a Pacific morning. Let us imagine what it was like to sit in that seat, to feel the vibration of the engines through the airframe, to watch the clouds slide past the windscreen, to listen to the radio and hear nothing but static where a guiding voice should have been. The cockpit of the Electra was a small world, self-contained and intimate despite its austerity. The instruments glowed softly in the dawn light, their familiar faces offering whatever comfort familiarity can provide in uncertain circumstances. The compass still pointed northeast. The airspeed indicator still showed 150 knots. The engines still ran with their deep, steady rhythm. In a way, nothing had changed from the hours before, when everything was proceeding according to plan. The aircraft flew on, obedient to its controls, burning fuel and covering distance exactly as it had been doing for the past 20 hours. The difference was only in what lay ahead, not a known destination growing closer with each minute, but an unknown emptiness that refused to resolve itself into anything recognizable. There is something almost peaceful about that image, if we set aside our knowledge of what was to come. A small aircraft, silver against the grey sky, flying steadily northeast above a floor of clouds. The pilot at the controls, hands light on the yoke, eyes scanning the horizon. The navigator at his table, working his calculations, plotting his lines. The engines humming their constant song. The fuel slowly diminishing. The morning light growing stronger. Everything contained within the moment, within the steady forward motion of flight, within the simple act of searching for what lies ahead. Amelia Earhart had spent her life reaching toward the horizon. From her earliest memories, she had been drawn to the sky, to the sensation of height and speed and the vast perspectives that only flight could provide. As a young woman in Kansas, she had watched a barnstorming pilot perform aerobatics above a county fair and felt something stir within her that would define the rest of her life. She had taken her first flying lesson in 1921, at the age of 23, and from that moment forward there had been no question about what her life would be devoted to. The world she entered was not welcoming to women pilots. The prevailing assumption was that flying was too demanding, too dangerous, too technical for the female mind and body. Amelia met these assumptions not with anger or defiance but with quiet competence, demonstrating through her actions what her words alone could never have proven. She flew, and she flew well, and she flew farther and higher and faster than anyone expected, not because she had anything to prove but because the sky called to her with a voice she could not ignore. Her crossing of the Atlantic in 1932, alone, remains one of the great achievements of aviation's golden age. 15 hours in a single-engine Vega, through storms and mechanical failures, across the cold dark expanse of the North Atlantic to a landing in an Irish cow pasture. The physical courage required for such a flight is almost beyond modern comprehension. The aircraft had no autopilot, no GPS, no weather radar, no pressurized cabin. It was simply a woman, an engine, and the sky, for 15 hours above an ocean that offered no second chances. But it was not the records or the fame that drove her. Reading her letters and her books, one encounters again and again a sensibility that valued the experience of flight itself above all its practical outcomes. She wrote about the beauty of clouds seen from above, about the particular quality of light at 30,000 feet, about the way the earth looked from the air, its patterns and textures revealed as they could never be from the ground. She wrote about the freedom of it, the sense of being released from the constraints of the surface world into a realm where the rules were different, where gravity was something to be negotiated rather than submitted to. There was a philosophical dimension to her relationship with aviation that set her apart from many of her contemporaries. While other pilots spoke of speed and distance and records, Amelia spoke of perspective and beauty and the expansion of human possibility. She saw flight not merely as a technical achievement but as a way of being in the world, a way of seeing that changed everything it touched. To fly was to understand the earth differently, to perceive its vastness and its fragility simultaneously, to feel both the power of human ingenuity and the humility that comes from confronting the immensity of the natural world. This quality, this particular blend of courage and contemplation, is perhaps what has kept her memory alive long after the records she set have been surpassed many times over. We remember her not because she was the fastest or the highest or the first, though she was all of these things at various points in her career. We remember her because she embodied something that transcends the specifics of aviation, something about the human desire to reach beyond the familiar and the safe, to extend ourselves into the unknown, to find out what lies beyond the horizon even when the horizon offers no guarantees. The Pacific Ocean on that July morning was the ultimate expression of that unknown. It stretched away from the Electra in every direction, measureless and indifferent, offering no landmarks, no waypoints, no reassurance. The island they sought was real, a physical place with coordinates and dimensions that could be written down and verified. But in the practical experience of searching for it, it might as well have been mythical, a place that existed only in theory, hidden somewhere in the vastness like a dream that dissolves upon waking. Navigation in the age before satellite positioning was an art as much as a science. The tools were ancient in their principles if not their construction. The sextant, which measured angles between celestial bodies and the horizon, the chronometer, which provided the precise time necessary to convert those angles into positions, the compass, which pointed toward magnetic north and required correction for the difference between magnetic and true direction. These tools, in skilled hands, could determine a position to within a few miles under ideal conditions. But conditions over the Central Pacific were rarely ideal, and a few miles of uncertainty in a world of water could mean the difference between finding a tiny island and missing it entirely. Fred Noonan was among the most experienced celestial navigators of his generation. His years with Pan American Airways had given him thousands of hours of practice over these same waters, and his skills were respected throughout the aviation community. But even the finest navigator is limited by the conditions in which he must work. Cloud cover that obscures the stars. A vibrating aircraft that makes sextant readings imprecise. A horizon that is hazy and indistinct. The accumulation of small errors over many hours. Each factor alone might be manageable, but together they could conspire to make precision navigation impossible. And so the aircraft flew on through the morning hours, searching. North and south along a line of latitude, the pilot's eye scanning the cloud breaks for any sign of land, the navigator recalculating and refining his estimates, the radio crackling with unanswered transmissions. The fuel continued its slow and irreversible decline, each minute narrowing the window of possibility, each gallon consumed reducing the distance that remained available for searching. There is a cruel mathematics to such a situation, a calculus of diminishing returns in which the longer you search without finding, the less time remains in which finding is possible. The clouds below were scattered now, alternating with patches of clear air through which the ocean was visible, blue-green and sparkling in the morning sun. When the aircraft descended to search at lower altitude, the view opened up, the texture of the waves, the patterns of current and wind written across the water's surface, the occasional shadow of a cloud drifting slowly across the glittering expanse. But no island. No pale ring of reef. No white line of surf breaking on a beach. Only water, in every direction, stretching to every horizon. From the air, the ocean near the equator is a particular shade of blue that seems to contain light within itself, a blue that is deeper and more saturated than anything found on land. It is the blue of depth, of water so clear and so deep that light enters it and travels downward until it is finally absorbed, leaving only the shorter wavelengths to be reflected back to the eye. The surface is alive with movement, not just the waves themselves but the play of light upon them, the glints and flashes of reflected sun that create a shimmering, constantly changing pattern across the water's face. Somewhere in those final minutes, a decision had to be made. The fuel gauges were approaching their limits. The island had not appeared. The radio direction finder had not provided the bearing they needed. The options were narrowing to a very few, and none of them were good. To continue searching was to risk running out of fuel in flight, with no choice about where or when the engines would fall silent. To attempt a water landing while fuel remained was to accept the certainty of putting the aircraft down on the open ocean, with all the risks that entailed, but with the possibility of choosing the conditions under which it would happen. A water landing in a twin-engine aircraft is a maneuver of extraordinary difficulty. The surface of the ocean, seen from the air, gives little indication of its actual state. Waves that appear smooth from altitude reveal themselves, on approach, to be solid walls of water that can tear an aircraft apart on impact. The technique requires touching down at the lowest possible speed, with the aircraft in a slightly nose-up attitude, along the crest of a wave rather than into its face. Even under the best conditions, with calm seas and a skilled pilot, the forces involved are enormous. The aircraft decelerates from flying speed to zero in a matter of seconds, the water catching at the fuselage and wings with a violence that can break structural members and burst fuel tanks. We do not know how it ended. That is the central truth of the story, the fact around which all the theories and speculations orbit like planets around a star. We do not know whether the engines stopped in flight or were shut down deliberately. We do not know whether the aircraft struck the water at speed or touched down gently. We do not know whether the occupants survived the initial event, whatever it was, and found themselves floating in the Pacific on a July morning, or whether the end came suddenly and without warning. The ocean has kept its secret for nearly a century now, and may keep it forever. But there is another way to think about that silence, a way that does not require resolution or certainty. Instead of asking what happened, we might simply acknowledge the moment as it was: two human beings, at the limits of their skill and their resources, facing the vast indifference of the natural world. It is a moment that belongs to the long history of human exploration, to the countless journeys that have ended not in triumph or disaster but in simple disappearance, the traveler swallowed by the landscape they sought to cross. The Arctic has taken explorers in this way, their expeditions vanishing into the ice with a completeness that allows no recovery. The great deserts of Asia and Africa have done the same, absorbing travelers into their immensity and leaving no trace of their passage. The oceans, more than any other environment, have claimed lives in their millions throughout human history, sailors and explorers and fishermen who set out from shore and never returned, their fates known only to the water that received them. In this context, Amelia Earhart's disappearance is not an anomaly but a continuation of a very old story. It is the story of human beings testing themselves against the world's vastness, reaching outward from the familiar into the unknown, accepting the risk that the unknown may not yield to their efforts. It is a story as old as the first boat launched from the first shore, as old as the first person to look at a mountain range and decide to cross it, as old as curiosity itself. The Pacific continues its ancient rhythms, undisturbed by the passage of human time. The sun rises and sets over its waters with the same regularity it has maintained for billions of years. The currents flow in their great circles, carrying warmth and nutrients and life from one shore to another. The storms form and dissipate, their energy drawn from the warm surface waters and spent in towering clouds and sheets of rain. The coral grows, layer upon layer, building islands from the patient accumulation of countless tiny lives. The fish swim in their schools, following the plankton that follows the currents that follow the sun. At the surface, where the atmosphere meets the hydrosphere, a constant exchange takes place. Water evaporates into the air, rising as invisible vapor until it reaches heights where the cold condenses it back into visible form, creating the clouds that drift across the sky and eventually return their moisture to the ocean as rain. This cycle has been running without interruption since the Earth first had both atmosphere and ocean, a circulation of water so vast and so continuous that every molecule in the sea has passed through the sky and back again many thousands of times. The trade winds blow steadily across the equatorial Pacific, warm and moisture-laden, pushing the surface water westward in a slow but inexorable drift. Where this water piles up against the island chains of the western Pacific, it warms further in the tropical sun and then sinks, beginning a deep circulation that carries it eastward along the ocean floor, cold and dense and rich in nutrients. This deep water may take centuries to complete its journey, moving slowly through the abyssal darkness before eventually rising again in the eastern Pacific, bringing its nutrients to the surface and feeding the great fisheries that have sustained human populations for millennia. On still nights, when the wind drops below a whisper, the surface of the Pacific takes on the quality of polished obsidian, black and reflective and perfectly smooth. The stars above are doubled by their reflection below, creating the illusion of floating in space, suspended between two identical fields of light. A boat on such a surface leaves a wake that persists for minutes, its V-shaped disturbance spreading outward in perfect symmetry until it fades back into the mirror stillness of the water. These calm nights are rare gifts offered by the ocean to those who happen to be present when the conditions align. More often, the surface is textured by wind and swell, its smoothness broken into patterns that shift and change with the restless energy of the atmosphere above. But even in its motion, the ocean has a quality of peace that is difficult to find anywhere on land. Its movements are slow and rhythmic, governed by forces so large and so constant that they feel less like motion and more like breathing, the exhalation and inhalation of something incomprehensibly vast. The color of the Pacific changes with the time of day and the angle of observation. At noon, directly overhead, the sun penetrates deep into the water, illuminating its upper layers in shades of the purest blue. At dawn and dusk, the angle of the light turns the surface to gold and copper and rose, colors that exist only in the thin boundary between air and water, where light bends and scatters in ways that create beauty from the simple interaction of photons and molecules. At night, The ocean has no color at all, or rather it has the color of everything reflected in it, silver when the moon is full, blue-black when only the stars provide illumination, absolute black when clouds cover the sky completely. Howland Island sits precisely where it has always been, its coordinates unchanged on every chart and map produced since its discovery. 1 degree 48 minutes north latitude, 176 degrees 38 minutes west longitude. A flat coral atoll, barely above sea level, its surface covered in scrubby vegetation and the accumulated guano of millions of seabirds. The lighthouse that the United States built on its shore in the 1930s still stands, its light long since extinguished, its structure slowly yielding to the salt wind and the tropical sun. The birds still nest there in their thousands, the terns and boobies and frigate birds that have made it their home since long before any human eye first saw it from the deck of a ship. The island exists in its own time, a geological time measured in thousands and millions of years, in which the events of a single July day in 1937 register as less than the blink of an eye. The coral that forms its base was laid down over millennia, each generation of polyps building upon the foundations of those that came before, creating solid rock from the dissolved minerals of seawater. The process continues today, as it has continued without pause through ice ages and warm periods, through the rise and fall of civilizations on distant continents, through all the dramas that human beings have enacted upon the world's surface. And perhaps there is something restful in that perspective, something calming about the recognition that the world continues its ancient work regardless of our presence upon it. The mystery of the lost aircraft is a human mystery, important to human hearts and human minds, but the Pacific does not share our urgency. The water that covers whatever remains of the Electra, if anything remains, does so without purpose or awareness. It simply is, as it has always been, as it will continue to be long after all our questions have been forgotten. In the darkness of the deep ocean, far below the reach of sunlight, there is a world of absolute silence and absolute pressure. The temperature hovers just above freezing, regardless of the season on the surface above. The creatures that live there are adapted to conditions that would kill any surface dweller instantly, their bodies designed for a world where light is created rather than received, where food drifts down from above like snow falling in a vast and endless winter. If the Electra came to rest in such a place, it would be slowly incorporated into this environment, its metal frame becoming a reef for the creatures of the deep, its surfaces colonized by the same corals and sponges that cover every other solid object at such depths. This is not a sad image, though it might seem so at first. It is an image of transformation rather than loss, of matter finding new purposes and new meanings as it passes from one form to another. The aluminium that once formed the skin of an aircraft, that once flew at 8,000 feet above the Pacific carrying 2 human lives toward an unseen destination, might now provide shelter for creatures that have never seen the sun. The instrument that once measured altitude might now be home to a small octopus that has made the dial housing its den. The glass that once formed a window onto the clouds might now be a surface on which tiny marine organisms grow and multiply in the darkness. But we need not descend to the depths to find peace in this story. The surface of the Pacific, on a calm night, is itself a place of extraordinary tranquility. The stars reflect in the water with a clarity that makes it difficult to tell where the sky ends and the ocean begins, the horizon dissolving into a seamless whole of light and darkness. The sound of the waves is gentle and rhythmic, a constant susurration that is the oldest sound on earth, the sound that the water has been making against itself since long before there were ears to hear it. On such a night, it is easy to understand why people have always been drawn to the ocean, despite its dangers and its indifference. There is something in its vastness that speaks to a corresponding vastness within the human spirit, something in its depth that resonates with our own inner depths. We are drawn to it because it is immeasurable, because it exceeds our capacity to comprehend it fully, because it represents the ultimate mystery, the unknown that lies beyond the limit of our knowledge. Amelia Earhart understood this. It is there in everything she wrote and said about flying, this awareness that the world contains more than we can ever explore, that every horizon conceals another horizon beyond it, that the act of reaching outward is valuable in itself, regardless of what is ultimately found. She did not fly to conquer the sky or to prove anything to doubters. She flew because the sky was there, because the horizon beckoned, because the unknown called to something fundamental in her nature that would not be denied. The night settles more deeply over the Pacific now. The stars wheel slowly overhead, tracing their ancient paths across the dome of heaven. The Southern Cross hangs low in the south, its four bright stars marking the direction of the pole that no land surrounds. Orion strides across the equatorial sky, his belt of 3 stars pointing the way to Sirius, the brightest star in all the night. The Milky Way stretches from horizon to horizon, a river of light containing billions of suns, each one perhaps the center of its own system of worlds, each one burning in the darkness with a light that has traveled for years or centuries or millennia to reach this point above the Pacific. In the face of such immensity, all human stories seem small. The flight of a single aircraft across a single ocean becomes one thread in a tapestry of such complexity that no mind can comprehend it whole. And yet it is precisely this smallness that gives our stories their poignancy, their power to move and to endure. We care about Amelia Earhart not despite the vastness of the universe but because of it. In a cosmos that seems indifferent to human endeavor, each act of courage and exploration takes on a significance that transcends its practical outcomes. It becomes a statement of intent, a declaration that human beings will not accept the boundaries that nature imposes without at least attempting to cross them. The ocean breathes beneath the stars, its surface rising and falling with the long slow rhythm of the deep swells that travel across its face without interruption. These swells are born in distant storms, their energy propagating across thousands of miles of open water, arriving on far shores as gentle undulations that barely disturb the surface. They are the ocean's memory of wind, a record of atmospheric events that may have occurred days ago and thousands of miles away. In their patient, unhurried travel, they embody the ocean's fundamental nature, vast, slow, patient, and eternal. As sleep approaches, we might imagine ourselves floating upon that ocean, not in danger or in distress, but simply resting upon its surface as though upon the gentlest of beds. The water supports us with perfect buoyancy, our weight distributed across its surface in a way that removes all pressure from any single point. The swells lift us and lower us with a motion so gradual, so gentle, that it is barely perceptible, a rocking that mimics the oldest comfort we have ever known. Above us, the stars maintain their vigil, their light reaching down through the clear air to touch our closed eyes with the faintest possible warmth. The sound of the water is everywhere, a sound that is both sound and silent simultaneously. It is the sound of molecules moving against molecules, of surface tension forming and breaking 1,000,000 times per second, of air and water meeting and parting in an endless dance. It requires no attention. It asks nothing of us. It simply exists, as a background to consciousness, as a support for the mind's gradual release from the concerns of the waking world. This is the Pacific's gift, offered without condition to anyone who will receive it. Not answers. Not certainty. Not the resolution of mysteries or the satisfaction of curiosity. Simply presence. Simply the vast, unhurried fact of its own existence, continuing as it has always continued, through all the days and nights of human history and all the days and nights that will follow after we are gone. The aircraft that once flew above these waters has passed from the realm of the physical into the realm of the imagined. It exists now in photographs and documents, in museums and memorials, in books and films and the memories of those who saw it fly. It exists in the questions we ask about it and the answers we construct from incomplete evidence. It exists in the way we tell its story, each telling slightly different from the last, each one shaped by the concerns and perspectives of the teller and the listener. And perhaps this is the most fitting memorial of all. Not a monument of stone or metal, not a plaque on a wall or a name on a building, but a story that continues to be told, a mystery that continues to be contemplated, a life that continues to inspire. Amelia Earhart lives on in the imagination because her story touches something universal, something that transcends the specifics of aviation and navigation and the particular geography of the Central Pacific. She lives on because she represents something we all recognize in ourselves, the desire to reach outward, to explore, to discover, to test ourselves against the world's immensity and see what we are capable of. The stars are fading now, the earliest light of dawn beginning to touch the eastern horizon with a barely perceptible brightness. The night is not yet over, but its depth is beginning to lessen, the absolute darkness giving way to the first suggestion of grey. It is the same dawn that rises over the Pacific every day, the same light that touched the clouds on that July morning in 1937, the same sun that has risen over these waters since before there were humans to watch it. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the deep Pacific, far from any land, far from any shipping lane, far from any human presence. It is not the absence of sound, for the ocean is never truly silent. It is rather the absence of any sound that carries meaning, any sound that requires interpretation or response. The waves make their soft, eternal murmur. The wind sighs across the surface. Somewhere far below, the deep currents move against the ocean floor with a vibration too low for human ears to perceive. But none of these sounds carry urgency. None of them demand attention. They simply exist, part of the fabric of the world, as constant and as unremarkable as the beating of one's own heart. It is in this kind of silence that the mind finally releases its grip on the day's concerns. The questions that seemed so pressing dissolve into the background, their urgency fading like the colors of a sunset fading into gray. What happened to the aircraft? Where did it come to rest? What were the final moments like? These questions, which have occupied so many minds for so many years, lose their sharpness in the face of the ocean's indifference. They become gentle curiosities rather than urgent demands, matters for contemplation rather than investigation, threads in the tapestry rather than loose ends requiring resolution. The bioluminescent creatures of the surface waters begin their nightly display, turning the wave crests into cascading ribbons of cold blue-green light. Each wave, as it breaks, reveals a million tiny organisms flashing in response to the disturbance, their light a chemical reaction triggered by movement, a defense against predators that has the unintended effect of turning the ocean's surface into a moving canvas of living light. A hand drawn through the water would leave a trail of sparks, bright and fleeting, fading back to darkness within seconds. This light is among the oldest forms of luminescence on Earth, predating the evolution of eyes by hundreds of millions of years. The organisms that produce it have no awareness of its beauty, no knowledge that their defensive chemistry creates something that human observers find deeply and inexplicably moving. They flash and fade and flash again, each one a brief spark of existence in the vast dark ocean, each one contributing to a display that is visible from space when the conditions are right. From the altitude at which the Electra flew, this bioluminescence would have been visible on moonless nights, a faint glow on the wave crests that revealed the ocean's surface even in the absence of any other light. Amelia may have seen it during those long night hours, the ocean beneath her flickering with its own cold fire, a reminder that even in the most apparently empty spaces, life continues its ancient work, creating beauty as a byproduct of survival. The trade wind clouds that form over the Pacific at night are among the most regular and predictable cloud formations on Earth. They build during the night hours as the warm, moist air rises from the ocean's surface and encounters cooler air above, condensing into flat-bottomed cumulus that arrange themselves in long parallel lines running downwind. By morning, they cover the sky in a regular pattern, like the scales of an enormous fish, each cloud identical in size and shape to its neighbors, each one casting its shadow on the water below. These clouds pass overhead in a steady procession, carried by the trade winds at speeds that seem gentle from the ground but are quite rapid from the perspective of an aircraft. The Electra would have flown through them, emerging from one cloud shadow into clear air only to enter the next a moment later, the light in the cockpit alternating between the brightness of direct sunlight and the grey dimness of cloud shadow with a regular rhythm that marked the passage of time as surely as any clock. Between the clouds, the sky is a blue so deep and so pure that it seems almost tangible, a substance rather than an absence, a presence rather than a void. At altitude, above the dust and moisture of the lower atmosphere, the sky reveals its true nature as a thin shell of gas surrounding a small rocky planet in an incomprehensibly vast universe. The blue is merely scattered sunlight, photons deflected by the molecules of the atmosphere, their shorter wavelengths redirected toward the observer's eye while the longer wavelengths pass through unimpeded. It is an illusion of sorts, a trick of physics that makes emptiness appear as substance. And yet, knowing this, the blue is no less beautiful. Perhaps it is more so, for being understood. Rest now, with the ocean. Let its rhythm become your rhythm. Let its patience become your patience. Let its vastness hold you as you drift toward sleep, supported by the same water that has supported all the journeys ever made across its surface. The mystery will still be there when you wake. The stars will still trace their paths across the night. The Pacific will still breathe with its ancient rhythm, rising and falling, advancing and retreating, patient and unhurried. The aircraft flies on, in some realm beyond the physical, in the place where all unfinished journeys continue forever. The engines hum their steady song. The compass points northeast. The clouds slide past the windscreen, white and grey against the blue. The pilot's hands are light upon the controls, guiding the aircraft with the gentle precision of long practice. The horizon stretches out ahead, infinite and inviting, always receding, always offering one more mile, one more minute, one more degree of longitude crossed. And the ocean, vast and patient, receives all things in time. It holds no judgments. It keeps its own counsel. It continues, as it has always continued, through all the nights and all the mornings that the earth has known. Let it continue now, beneath you and around you, as you settle into the deep waters of sleep. The current will carry you where it will. The stars will watch over you. The night will hold you until the morning comes. Sleep comes now like a tide, slow and inevitable, rising from somewhere deep within the body and spreading upward through the limbs and into the mind. It is not something to be fought or resisted. It is a natural movement, as natural as the ocean's breathing, as natural as the turning of the earth that brings the stars across the sky. Let it come. Let it carry you. Let it take you down into its depths, where all is quiet and all is still, where the questions of the waking world dissolve into the simple, wordless peace of rest. The Pacific sleeps beneath the stars. The fish sleep in their coral gardens. The birds sleep on their islands, their heads tucked beneath their wings. The clouds sleep as they drift across the sky, their shapes slowly changing in the darkness. And somewhere, in the vast and patient deep, whatever remains of a silver aircraft rests in its own kind of sleep, surrounded by the eternal darkness and the eternal silence of the ocean floor. The night is long, and the ocean is kind. Rest now. Rest deeply. Let the waves carry you away from the shore of waking, out into the open water of sleep, where the horizon is always distant and the sky is always full of stars. The story will wait for you. The mystery will keep. The morning will come in its own time, as it always does, with its own light and its own warmth and its own promises of new horizons to explore. Breathe deeply. Rest completely. Sleep.